Activision announced no Overwatch 2 in 2021, more news to come in Blizzcon later this day, and the LA Valiant going east. I am Black Widow and this is the Overwatch Esports Rapport. Two weeks ago, Activision announced that it's going very well with the company, especially due to Call of Duty and the acquisition of King, mostly known for their mobile games. But unfortunately, they also announced that there will be no major projects from Blizzard in 2021, meaning there will be no Overwatch 2 and Diablo 4 released in 2021. This is a major blow for the Overwatch community because the last major update was the release of Echo in April 2020. We also saw the release of a new free-for-all map, Kanazaka, but it isn't used in the Overwatch League, so it isn't viable for esports. And with the release of Overwatch 2 probably in 2022, but fingers crossed, we might not see any major updates in 2021. Fortunately, with BlizzCon on the horizon, we might see some updates on Overwatch 2, or you might see some content that wasn't supposed to release for the original Overwatch make it in 2021. So let's see what's happening. BlizzCon will be tonight at 11 PM CEST. We will also see the San Francisco Shock, the 2019 and 2020 champions of the Overwatch League, play against community figures and former pros on the big stage on BlizzCon. There are also some rumors that John Spector, VP of the Overwatch League, will release some updates on the 2021 format. Speaking of John Spector, he did release some updates in a video a couple weeks prior about the Overwatch League 2021. Due to the pandemic, they still have to do online tournaments instead of offline tournaments, what they were supposed to do with the homestands that we saw last year, which unfortunately were cancelled from April. The format will be similar to the format we saw last year after the outbreak. This means the Overwatch League will be split into two regions, the Eastern region from Asia and the Western region, mostly NA but also Europe. Each region will play a monthly tournament with monthly prizes for the best teams, and they hope they will be able to let the best teams from each region play against each other just before the grand finals later this year. There are some changes in the regions. For example, some teams have changed region. The Philadelphia Fusion and the Los Angeles Valiant have moved from the Western region to the Eastern region, and the London Spitfire have moved back to the Western region to compete against North American and European teams. According to Spectre, they're still striving for worldwide competition. They're currently experimenting with a low latency feature that will make competition fair between the two regions, so they can play on every region and without any disadvantage with ping or anything like that. So let's see what happens with that. Talking about the LA Valiant, there are some rumors that a Chinese group will take ownership over the LA Valiant. Immortals Gaming Group have declined those acquisitions. They say they will remain active as the owners of the LA Valiant. They also released their entire roster consisting of Korean players, North American players, European players and Australian players. And the rumors are that they will be trying to get a Chinese roster. Earlier today, they actually released a tweet that they'll be saying that London Esports, a Chinese team, will be taking operations from the LA Valiant in 2021, and a roster will be announced soon. The LA Valiant were definitely not the only team that dropped their entire roster, so let's take a look at some of the biggest announcements that were made during a crazy transfer window in 2021. The Paris Eternal dropped their entire roster in favor of a completely European team, which is kind of strange because they already had some European players, but they decided they wanted to have a fresh start, and they picked up Onigod, former Dallas Fuel DPS player, former Washington Justice off-tank Alivote, and Dutch main tank Daan, among some other players from the European region. But where did the players from the Paris Eternal go? Soon, star DPS player went to the Boston Uprising. FD God went to the San Francisco Shock, replacing two-time champion Moth, who went to the LA Gladiators. And the Dallas Fuel picked up the entire Korean roster, plus the head coach Rush, for Element Mystic Reunion. They also picked up Fearless from the Shanghai Dragons, and Jackson and Rappel from the Rivals, the Houston Outlaws, making an almost entire Element Mystic roster. Plus Flex DPS Fielder, but he was so good that they really couldn't let him go, I guess. The San Francisco Shock, I already mentioned them. They've released Moth in favor of FD God from the Paris Eternal. They also had to release Rascal and Ants. Especially Ants is very unfortunate because he had to retire due to health problems. I hope everything is well with you, Ants. and hopefully when everything gets better, you'll return to Overwatch League. But for now, your health is way more important, so good luck. But who did replace Ansel and Rascal? Well, the first one is North American player Nero, who came from the Guangzhou Charge. The second one is London Spitfire star DPS player Callister. The Houston Outlaws also dropped most of their roster, only retaining Hydration and Dante as the DPS players. And although it isn't that special what they brought in, except for Jake, who unretired. He was a former Houston Outlaws player in 2018-2019, but retired for a commentary job in the Overwatch League. But he came back to play with the Houston Outlaws, which is great because he's a great figure for the Overwatch League. He's a great personality within the Overwatch community, very positive. So I'm glad he's back. The second player worth mentioning is Jupi, who was playing in the collegiate scene and is now the first player who ever was brought up from the collegiate scene to the Overwatch League. And hopefully there are way more to come. So Jupi, let's see what you got, and hopefully you do well in the Overwatch League with the Houston Outlaws. The last team I want to mention is the London Spitfire. I already mentioned them before, that they went from the Eastern region to the Western region. The reason behind that is that they dropped their entire Korean roster in favor of a mostly European roster. What did they do? Well, they promoted their entire British Hurricane except for Dennett, who unfortunately was dropped, and Sparker, who is underage right now, so he has to play with the British Hurricane for at least a couple of months until he's 18. Then they also brought in Blase from Houston Outlaws as the only American player. They brought in British prospect Hybrid on the headscan DPS position, and they brought in Shax from the LA Valiant. And now it's time for Overwatch Contenders, the tier 2 scene. Although I mostly focus on the European scene, I think it's worth mentioning that there are some changes on the entire format. Esports manager Dan McHugh announced on Reddit that they will be dropping the South American Overwatch Contenders scene because they don't see the results that they wanted from that scene. They did the same in the Pacific region last year, and they're trying to make it possible for third-party organizers to make a lot of events. For international events, they're trying to include the South American and Pacific region, but they're still trying to figure out how they're going to do it. Unfortunately, for the other regions, the European, North American, Korean, Chinese, and Australian region, not a lot has been announced, except for the fact that there will be 2 seasons starting in roughly March with Overwatch Contenders Trials. They've also announced that they will be mostly focusing on online competition because they don't think that LAN will happen in 2021. They prefer focusing on online competition so they get the best possible result out of that. And last but not least, some roster announcements, starting with the British Hurricane. Obviously most of the players were promoted, except for Sparkar, who is now on a 2-way contract, and Dennett, who was dropped. They picked up some of the best players of their competition. Festola joined the British Hurricane as an off-tank from Ex Oblivione. Yakits and Sky Reaper came from Young and Beautiful. And last but not least, Admiral and Health came from Obey Alliance, the only team that managed to beat the British Hurricane in a regular season match. Young and Beautiful have announced that they will be dropping their entire roster and staff. JVP, the former general manager, will step up, I guess, as owner, and they'll announce a new roster and new staff soon. They already announced that Jasimba will be the new general manager, but fortunately they will stay in the Overwatch contender scene with a new roster. The same can't be said about the Angry Titans. They have announced that they will discontinue any operations in Overwatch because they don't think there's any future in the Overwatch scene right now. They will move on to the Valorant scene, the new game from Riot. It's very unfortunate to see the Angry Titans go. They're a big staple in European Overwatch, and they always had great talent like Onigod and Elivote from Paris Eternal, and they recently also had Visility, the Dutch Flex DPS player, who I also actually made a video of. You can see that right there. So if you like to see some great Overwatch play, check the video out. And that was it for this episode of Overwatch Esports Rapport. If you want to stay up to date on the Overwatch League and Overwatch Contenders Europe, I recommend subscribing, and I'll release a new video in 2 weeks. Don't forget that Blizzard will start the opening ceremony of Blizzcon at 11 PM CEST. And I hope you enjoy the show, and hopefully we'll see some new Overwatch 2 updates. My name is Black Widow from Black Widow Esports. I wish you a nice day. Howdo.